Picture this, June 2024, Adams County, Nebraska. The fairgrounds that have hosted the annual county fair since 1912 are undergoing a massive infrastructure upgrade. Part of this project involves draining a retention pond, a body of water that's been there for over 70 years, collecting runoff from the fairgrounds and surrounding farmland. It's never been fully drained before, just maintained at acceptable levels, a fixture of the landscape that generations of Nebraska farm families have passed by without much thought. On June 12, 2024, as pumps lower the water level for the first time in decades, something begins to emerge from the muddy bottom. At first, it looks like an old farm implement, some piece of rusted machinery dumped decades ago. But as more water recedes, the shape becomes unmistakable. It's a car, a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air in what was once a brilliant Nassau blue, now faded and covered in diary sediment, sitting upright on the lake bottom as if it had simply driven in and never left. Within hours, the Adams County Sheriff's Department has divers examining the vehicle. What they discover sends shockwaves through this quiet farming community. Inside the Chevrolet are two sets of skeletal remains, preserved by the cold water and sealed environment. The license plate, corroded but still readable, tells a story that this county has whispered about for 65 years. Nebraska 74829. Registered to Daniel Brown of Hastings. Last seen on August 15, 1959, leaving the Adams County Fair with his girlfriend, Betty Richardson. They were never seen again. For 65 years, Daniel Brown's family believed he'd run away, abandoned his farm, his parents, his responsibilities. For 65 years, Betty Richardson's family mourned a daughter they thought had eloped or met with foul play. For 65 years, the truth was right there, 20 feet beneath the surface of a lake that no one thought to search. Because who would imagine that a car leaving a county fair could end up in the retention pond? If you're captivated by stories where the truth hides in plain sight for generations, where assumptions shape decades of grief, then subscribe right now. Hit that button, because what I'm about to share is a story that will break your heart and make you question everything you think you know about unsolved disappearances. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this discovery has forced an entire community to re-examine a tragedy they thought they understood. The question isn't just how Daniel's car ended up in that lake. The question is, why did everyone assume he'd run away when the answer was right there all along? Daniel Brown was 26 years old in the summer of 1959, the embodiment of what people meant when they talked about sturdy farm stock. Standing at 6'2", with broad shoulders and strong arms built from years of physical labor, Daniel had the kind of presence that came from quiet confidence rather than bravado. His sandy blonde hair was always slightly sun-bleached, kept short and practical, and his blue eyes had permanent squint lines from working in bright Nebraska sunshine. His face was tanned and weathered in the way of young men who worked outdoors, making him look older than his years. His hands told the story of his life. They were large and calloused, scarred from farm work, capable of fixing machinery, mending fences, doing the 1,000 small repairs that kept a farm running. But those same hands could be surprisingly gentle, something Betty Richardson had noticed early in their courtship, the way he'd held a baby lamb or adjusted a delicate piece of engine timing. Born in 1933 on the family farm just outside Hastings, Daniel was the eldest of 4 children. His father, Robert Brown, owned 300 acres of prime Nebraska farmland, growing corn and wheat, raising cattle and hogs. Daniel had been working that land since he was old enough to walk behind his father, learning the rhythms of planting and harvest, understanding that farming wasn't just a job, but a way of life that demanded everything you had. He'd graduated from Hastings High School in 1951, near the top of his class, despite the demands of farm work that often kept him from extracurricular activities. There had been talk of college, of agricultural studies at the University of Nebraska, but his father's health had started failing around that time. Someone needed to run the farm, and Daniel, as the eldest son, understood what was expected. He'd stayed home, taken on more responsibility, and by 1959 was essentially running the Brown family operation. His typical day started at 4:30 a.m. before the sun rose over the flat Nebraska plains. He'd milk the cows, feed the livestock, check on whatever crops were in the fields, all before breakfast at 6:30 with his family. His mother, Martha, would have prepared eggs, bacon, toast, and strong coffee, the kind of substantial meal that fueled hard physical labor. After breakfast, the real work began, varying with the season, but always demanding, always necessary, always there. But Daniel wasn't just a farmer. He had interests beyond the land, aspirations that farming life didn't completely fulfill. He loved cars, spent his limited free time working on engines, attending car shows, reading automotive magazines. The 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air he'd purchased in the spring of 1958 represented his one real indulgence. Bought used, but in excellent condition, that distinctive Nassau blue paint job turning heads whenever he drove into town. Betty Richardson had caught his eye at a church social in the fall of 1957. She was 22 then, working as a secretary at the Adams County Courthouse, living with her parents on the east side of Hastings. Petite at 5'4", with dark brown hair she wore in the popular page boy style, and warm hazel eyes, Betty had a quick wrath and an independent streak that Daniel found both challenging and captivating. Their courtship followed the patterns of rural Nebraska in the 1950s. Church functions, community dances, the occasional movie in town, drives in the country in that blue Chevrolet. By the summer of 1959, everyone in Hastings assumed they'd marry eventually, though Daniel hadn't formally proposed. There was a comfortable understanding between them, or so it seemed to outsiders, though those closest to the couple knew there were tensions. Betty wanted more than Hastings could offer. She talked about moving to Lincoln or Omaha, about opportunities in bigger cities, about a life beyond the farm. Daniel was tied to the land, to family obligations, to a way of life he couldn't easily abandon. They'd argued about it, not viciously, but with the kind of frustrated intensity that comes from two people who love each other but want different futures. Daniel's family liked Betty, but worried she'd pull their son away from his responsibilities. Betty's parents approved of Daniel's character, but questioned whether their daughter would be happy as a farmer's wife. Everyone had opinions about their relationship, as people do in small towns where everyone's business is community property. The Adams County Fair was the social highlight of the Nebraska summer, a week-long celebration in mid-August that brought the entire county together. There were livestock competitions, agricultural exhibits, carnival rides, food vendors, and entertainment. For farming communities, the fair was both business and pleasure, a chance to showcase the year's work and to socialize with neighbors you might not see regularly otherwise. In 1959, the Adams County Fair ran from August 10th through August 15th, a Saturday-to-Saturday schedule that allowed maximum attendance. Daniel had entered several of his cattle in competition and spent much of the week at the fairgrounds, tending to his animals, talking with other farmers, examining new equipment and techniques. Betty had come to the fair most evenings after work, meeting Daniel there, walking the midway, enjoying the festive atmosphere. August 15th, 1959 was the final day of the fair, a buzzy Saturday that promised to end the week with a bang. The weather had been perfect all week, temperatures in the high 70s with clear skies, and Saturday was more of the same. Daniel spent the day at the fair, his Hereford heifer having won second place in her class, an achievement he was quietly proud of. The prize money wasn't significant, but the recognition mattered in a community where reputation and skill were valued currencies. Betty had arrived at the fairgrounds around 6 p.m., having spent the day helping her mother with weekend chores. She looked lovely, wearing a yellow sundress that Daniel particularly liked, her hair fresh from the beauty parlor, makeup carefully applied. They'd met near the livestock barn, walked through the exhibits, stopped for dinner at the food tents, corn dogs and lemonade and funnel cakes, the kinds of indulgences that Fair Week allowed. But as the evening progressed, witnesses later reported the couple seemed tense. They were seen having what appeared to be a serious disagreement.
Conversation near the Ferris wheel around 8 p.m., Betty gesturing emphatically, Daniel standing with his hands in his pockets, head down. Around 9:30 p.m., they were spotted near the parking area, Betty visibly upset, Daniel trying to calm her, their voices raised enough that nearby families noticed, though no one heard the specific words. At approximately 10:45 p.m., as the fair was closing down for the night, Daniel and Betty were seen getting into the blue Chevrolet Bel Air parked in the overflow lot on the north side of the fairgrounds. Multiple witnesses remembered because Betty had slammed the car door with enough force that people looked over, and because the Chevrolet, distinctive and well-maintained, was a car people in Hastings recognized. The car pulled out of the lot heading north on what would have been the route back to town. That was the last time anyone saw Daniel Brown or Betty Richardson alive. The fairgrounds in 1959 were bordered on the north side by farmland, with a gravel access road leading from the overflow parking lot toward the main highway. Between the lot and the road was the retention pond, created in the 1940s to manage water drainage from the fair and surrounding properties. It was roughly 50 feet across, 20 feet deep at its deepest point, and ringed with tall grass and cattails that made the water's edge difficult to see clearly, especially at night. On that August 15th night, there was no moon. The parking lot lights illuminated only the immediate area, and once you drove past them, heading toward the access road, you were in darkness, broken only by your headlights. The retention pond had no lights, no barriers, no warning signs. It was just there, a known feature of the landscape that locals were aware of, but that posed no obvious danger to anyone who knew the area. Betty Richardson's parents expected her home by midnight. When 1 a.m. came and went with no Betty, they began to worry. By 2 a.m., they'd called Daniel's parents, waking the Brown family from sleep. Daniel wasn't home either. By 3 a.m., both families had called the Adams County Sheriff's Department. The initial response was measured. Two young people in a relationship that reportedly had its tensions hadn't come home after the county fair. The first assumption was that they'd eloped, driven to some neighboring state to get married without family drama. It happened, particularly with couples whose families had doubts about their relationship. Deputies took a report but suggested waiting until morning to see if the couple showed up or called. But morning came and neither Daniel nor Betty appeared. Sunday, August 16th brought growing alarm. Daniel's father, Robert, drove to the fairgrounds to see if the Chevrolet was still there. The overflow lot was empty except for some scattered trash and tire tracks in the dust. Robert drove the route Daniel would have taken home, looking for any sign of the car or an accident. He found nothing. Betty's father, James Richardson, called the courthouse where Betty worked, though he knew it was closed on Sunday. He called her friends, her extended family, anyone who might know where she'd gone. No one had any information. Betty had told several people she was going to the fair with Daniel on Saturday night, but she'd said nothing about any plans beyond that. By Monday morning, August 17th, the Sheriff's Department was treating this as a serious missing persons case. Deputies fanned out across Adams County, checking roads, talking to anyone who'd been at the fair Saturday night, looking for the distinctive blue Chevrolet Bel Air with Nebraska plates 74829. Witnesses came forward with their observations, the couple arguing, Betty upset, the car leaving the lot around 10:45 p.m. This information shaped the investigation's direction. The working theory became that Daniel and Betty had driven away after an argument, perhaps to talk privately, perhaps heading somewhere to continue their disagreement away from the crowds. But where? The roads around Hastings were searched thoroughly. State highway patrol officers checked routes to neighboring towns. Telegrams were sent to law enforcement agencies across Nebraska and surrounding states, asking them to watch for the vehicle. Family members drove country roads looking for any sign of an accident, any indication that the car had run off the road. Nothing was found. The Chevrolet Bel Air seemed to have vanished as completely as the two young people inside it. As days became
weeks, the theories grew darker. Had Daniel and Betty been victims of foul play? The late 1950s saw occasional violence on rural highways, though it was relatively rare. Had they been robbed, killed, their cars stolen? But there were no reports of the Chevrolet being seen anywhere, and the car was too distinctive to hide easily. Had they run away together? This theory gained traction, particularly within Daniel's family. Maybe the argument had been the final straw. Maybe they decided to leave Hastings, start fresh somewhere else, where family expectations and community judgments wouldn't constrain them. Betty had talked about wanting to leave, after all. Maybe Daniel had finally agreed. But this theory had problems too. Neither Daniel nor Betty had taken anything with them beyond what they were wearing. Daniel's savings, modest but real, remained in his bank account. Betty's belongings were all in her room at her parents' house. They'd left no notes, made no preparations, taken no steps that suggested planned departure. The darkest theory, whispered rather than spoken aloud, was murder-suicide. Maybe the argument had been worse than witnesses realized. Maybe in a moment of passion or despair, one of them had done something terrible. But where would this have happened, and where was the car? Months passed. The Brown family had to make difficult decisions about the farm. Daniel's younger brother, 16-year-old Thomas, took on more responsibilities. Robert Brown, despite his failing health, worked longer hours to keep the operation running. The family's grief was complicated by uncertainty. Was Daniel dead, or had he abandoned them? Should they mourn, or should they be angry? Betty Richardson's family faced similar torment. Her mother, Helen, kept Betty's room exactly as she'd left it, unable to accept that her daughter might be gone forever. Her father, James, spent weekends driving country roads, looking for any clue, any sign, growing more desperate and exhausted as time passed with no answers. The case remained officially open, but by 1960, active investigation had essentially ceased. There were no new leads to follow, no evidence to examine, no direction to take the inquiry. The file sat on a desk at the Adams County Sheriff's Department, periodically reviewed, but never advancing. The community formed its own consensus, as communities do. Most people believed Daniel and Betty had run away together, that they were living somewhere under assumed names, having chosen to leave their past behind. This narrative, while painful for the families, had the virtue of avoiding more tragic conclusions. It allowed people to imagine the couple somewhere out there, alive, if misguided, making a life together far from Nebraska. The 1960s arrived, bringing social changes and cultural shifts that made 1959 feel increasingly distant. The Brown family continued farming, though the joy had gone out of it for Robert, who died in 1967, still not knowing what happened to his eldest son. Thomas Brown took over the farm, married, had children, built a life in his brother's shadow. At family gatherings, Daniel's name was rarely mentioned, the pain too deep, the questions too unanswerable. Betty Richardson's parents moved to Arizona in 1972, unable to bear living in a town filled with memories and questions. They died within months of each other in 1984, never knowing their daughter's fate. Betty's younger sister, Susan, remained in Nebraska, married with her own family, but she never stopped wondering about the sister who'd vanished on that August night. The Adams County Fair continued every August, an institution too important to the community to abandon. The fairgrounds were updated over the decades, new buildings erected, old ones torn down or renovated. The retention pond remained a functional but largely ignored feature of the property. Generations of fairgoers walked past it, parked near it, never knowing what it contained. In 1983, when drought lowered water levels across Nebraska, the retention pond dropped several feet, exposing muddy banks. No one thought to look beneath the surface. In 1993, when the Fair Board discussed filling in the pond to create more parking, the plan was ultimately rejected as too expensive. The pond stayed, slowly silting up, gradually becoming shallower, but still deep enough to hide its secret. Thomas Brown, Daniel's younger brother, was 81 in 2024, living in a nursing home in Hastings. He'd long since sold the family farm, unable to maintain it as he aged. He rarely talked about Daniel, the brother who'd been more like a father figure when he was young.
the brother whose disappearance had shaped his entire life. He'd concluded decades ago that Daniel had run away, choosing Betty and freedom over family obligations. Thomas had tried not to resent him for it, tried to understand, but the anger never completely faded. Susan Richardson Carter, Betty's younger sister, was 83 in 2024, still living in Hastings, in the house where she and Betty had grown up. She'd spent decades researching missing persons, hoping somehow to find information about her sister. The internet age had given her new tools, and she'd searched databases, joined online forums, followed every lead that seemed even remotely promising. Nothing had ever brought her closer to the truth. And then, in June 2024, the Adams County Fair Board, facing the reality of aging infrastructure, secured a grant to upgrade drainage and water management systems at the fairgrounds. Part of the project required completely draining the old retention pond, something that had never been done in its 80-year existence. The work began on June 10th. Massive pumps were brought in, and the water level began to drop. It took 2 days to lower the pond enough that the bottom became visible through the murky water. On June 12th, at approximately 2 p.m., a Fair Board member named Robert Hayes, supervising the work, saw something that made him call for the pumps to stop. There was a car down there, submerged for so long that it had become part of the lake bottom ecosystem, covered in sediment and algae, but unmistakably a car. Robert called the Adams County Sheriff's Department immediately. By 4 p.m., the site was swarming with law enforcement, the state police, and forensic teams. The pumps continued working under careful supervision, lowering the water further while experts planned how to recover the vehicle and its contents. What emerged over the next 12 hours was a time capsule from 1959. The Baywa 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, though corroded and damaged by decades underwater, was identifiable by its distinctive shape and by the license plate that was still attached to the rear bumper. Nebraska 74829. A quick check of historical DMV records confirmed what the more knowledgeable locals had already suspected. This was Daniel Brown's car. Inside the vehicle were 2 sets of skeletal remains. The driver still behind the wheel, the passenger slumped against the door. Both had been there for 65 years, their bodies protected from complete decomposition by the sealed car interior and the cold, low-oxygen environment of the pond bottom. The recovery operation took days, each step carefully documented, each piece of evidence meticulously preserved. The car was lifted from the pond by crane, water streaming from every opening, and placed on a flatbed truck for transport to a forensic facility in Lincoln. Susan Richardson Carter received the phone call on June 13, 2024. She'd been expecting a call from her doctor about test results, and when she saw it was from the Adams County Sheriff's Department, her first thought was that something had happened to a family member. The deputy's words didn't make sense at first. They'd found a car in the Fairground pond. They believed it was Betty Richardson's boyfriend's vehicle from 1959. There were remains. Susan sat down heavily, the phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. After 65 years, after a lifetime of wondering, they'd found her sister. Thomas Brown, in the nursing home, heard the news from his daughter, who'd gotten a call from the sheriff. Thomas wept, something his family had rarely seen. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of having been wrong for 65 years. His brother hadn't abandoned the family. Daniel hadn't chosen Betty over his responsibilities. Something terrible had happened, something accidental and tragic, and the family had blamed him, resented him, when all along he'd been dead just yards from where they'd searched. The forensic examination took weeks. Dental records preserved in old files at the Hastings dentist's office confirmed the identities: Daniel Brown and Betty Richardson. The cause of death appeared to be drowning, No evidence of trauma beyond what would be expected from a vehicle accident. The car itself told the story. The Chevrolet entered the water from the north side of the retention pond, the side adjacent to a highway,
closest to the access road leading from the overflow parking lot. Examination of the vehicle's position and the pond bottom suggested the car had been moving at moderate speed when it left the road, angling down the slight embankment and into the water. The darkness, the lack of visible water and the tall grass, and the unfamiliarity of the exact pond location — Daniel didn't use that particular lot regularly — combined to create a tragic accident. What likely happened, investigators concluded, was this. Daniel and Betty, leaving the fairgrounds after their argument, had been distracted, upset, not paying close attention to the route. Daniel had probably taken a wrong turn, heading down what he thought was the access road, but was actually a path that led directly to the pond. By the time he realized the error, it was too late. The Chevrolet had plunged into the dark water. The car would have floated briefly, perhaps 30 seconds to a minute, giving Daniel and Betty time to realize what was happening, but not enough time to escape. The doors, pressed shut by water pressure, would have been nearly impossible to open. The windows, rolled up on that August night, equally impossible to break from inside without tools. They would have been trapped as the car filled with water and sank to the bottom. It would have been quick, at least. Cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Daniel Brown and Betty Richardson died together, probably within minutes of leaving the fairgrounds, not from violence or malice, but from a terrible accident aided by darkness and bad timing. But why had no one found them in 1959? This question haunted everyone involved in the 2024 investigation. The search had been extensive, thorough, involving dozens of people. How had they missed a car that was less than 100 yards from where it was last seen? The answer lay in the combination of factors that made the retention pond effectively invisible as a search target. First, it wasn't considered a likely location. Cars leaving the fairgrounds didn't go near the pond, or weren't supposed to. The access road ran beside it, but not into it. There was no reason to think anyone would drive into the water. Second, the pond was dark, murky, and surrounded by tall vegetation. Even in 1959, looking at the water from the shore wouldn't reveal a submerged car, particularly one that had settled to tilt the bottom in 20 feet of water. The pond's surface would show nothing unusual. Third, 1959 technology couldn't search effectively underwater. There was no sonar, no underwater cameras, no diving equipment that could safely reach the pond's depth and navigate the murky water. Even if someone had suggested searching the pond, the means to do so thoroughly simply didn't exist. Finally, and perhaps most critically, once the theory that Daniel and Betty had run away gained traction, searches focused elsewhere. Investigators looked for people who'd left voluntarily, checking bus stations, interviewing people who might have given them rides, following leads that took them hundreds of miles from Hastings. No one was looking for an accident victim because everyone assumed the couple had left on purpose. The discovery forced a complete reevaluation of the case and a reckoning with assumptions that had shaped 65 years of family history and community memory. Daniel Brown hadn't abandoned his family. He died trying to drive his girlfriend home after an argument at the fairgrounds. Betty Richardson hadn't eloped or met with foul play. She died in a tragic accident, her last moments spent with a young man she loved, despite their disagreements. For Thomas Brown, the revelation was devastating. He'd spent his entire adult life believing his brother had been selfish, had chosen romance over responsibility, had left their father to struggle alone. The anger and resentment he'd carried for 65 years were based on a complete misunderstanding. Daniel had been dead all along, just yards from where the family had searched, and Thomas had thought terrible things about him, had spoken ill of him at family gatherings, had taught his own children that their uncle was an example of what not to do. Susan Richardson Carter faced similar emotional turmoil. Her sister hadn't run away. Betty had died at 24, her life cut short, not by choice, but by cruel chance. All the years Susan had spent searching, wondering, hoping Betty might still be alive somewhere, were revealed as futile. But at least now she knew. At least now she could grieve properly. The remains of Daniel Brown and Betty
Richardson were released to their families in August 2024, almost exactly 65 years after they died. A joint funeral service was held at the First Methodist Church in Hastings, attended by hundreds of people. Some remembered Daniel and Betty personally, elderly residents who'd been young in 1959. Most knew them only as a tragic story, a mystery finally solved. Thomas Brown, frail but determined, spoke at the service. He apologized to his brother, asked forgiveness for the resentment and anger, acknowledged that he'd been wrong about everything. He wept openly. The weight of 65 years of misunderstanding finally lifted, but replaced by grief that could now flow freely. Susan Carter spoke about her sister, about the bright, ambitious young woman who'd wanted more from life, who died before having the chance to discover what that more might be. She talked about how families can be wrong, how assumptions can persist for generations, how important it is to question what we think we know. Daniel and Betty were buried together at Daniel's family plot in the Hastings Cemetery, a decision both families supported. The headstone bears both names, both dates, and a simple inscription: "Together in life's last moment, together forever after." The 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, after forensic examination, was restored by a group of classic car enthusiasts working with both families. It will be displayed at the Adams County Historical Museum, a memorial to Daniel and Betty, and a reminder of how easily tragedy can hide in plain sight. The retention pond at the fairgrounds has been filled in, replaced with proper drainage systems. A small memorial garden marks the spot, with a plaque explaining what happened there on August 15, 1959, and how the truth remained hidden for 65 years. So, what really happened that night? The evidence and investigation provide the answer. Daniel Brown, upset and distracted after arguing with Betty Richardson, left the Adams County Fair and took a wrong turn in the darkness. His Chevrolet Bel Air, moving at moderate speed, drove into the retention pond before he could react. The car sank quickly, trapping both occupants, who drowned within minutes. The darkness, the murky water, the lack of witnesses, and the thick vegetation around the pond meant no one saw the accident happen. The car settled on the bottom and remained there for 65 years, hidden by water and assumptions. But the tragedy extends beyond the accident itself. It's in the 65 years that Daniel's family believed he'd abandoned them. It's in the resentment and anger that poisoned family relationships for generations. It's in Betty's mother keeping her daughter's room untouched for decades, hoping for a return that would never come. It's in Susan Richardson Carter spending her entire adult life searching for a sister who was less than a mile from where she lived. The Adams County Fair still happens every August. People ride the same rides, eat the same fair food, enjoy the same summer evening atmosphere that Daniel and Betty experienced on that last night. But now there's an awareness, a recognition that tragedy can happen in the most ordinary circumstances, that assumptions can be devastatingly wrong, and that sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we imagine. If you have information about any unsolved disappearance, particularly older cases from before modern investigative technology, authorities encourage you to come forward. Modern techniques, ground-penetrating radar, underwater sonar, DNA analysis have made it possible to solve mysteries that previous generations couldn't. Every missing person deserves to be found. Every family deserves to know the truth.
Daniel Brown was 26 years old, a responsible young man trying to balance family duty and personal happiness when he died in a senseless accident. Betty Richardson was 24, an ambitious woman trying to figure out her future when that future was stolen by bad luck and darkness. They both deserved better than to spend 65 years at the bottom of a pond while the world moved on above them, while their families suffered from not knowing, while their memories were tarnished by false assumptions. But at least now the truth is known. At least now they can rest in peace. And at least now the families can grieve for what actually happened rather than what they imagined happened. The truth, even when it comes 65 years too late, still matters.